Have you ever wondered who the greatest UFC champion is of all time? Well, me too. That's why I'm doing this video. This is the first ever tier rankings video on the MMA Movement channel. What we're going to do is we're going to rank every single UFC champion of all time. We have 82 champions in total, and we're going to rank them from S to D. S basically means special, amazing, A+. Then A through D is like your grading scale in school. Okay, so there are some ground rules to this list. We are ranking based only on championship reigns, so when they won the belt to when they lost it or vacated it or whatever. We're not including interim champions, so the likes of Colby Covington aren't included here. However, if an interim champion does unify their belt, then their interim run will be considered. UFC tournament or UFC super fight champions aren't included from the old days. And also rankings consider strength of schedule, number of title defenses, historical impact, wow factor, entertainment factor of a title reign, and so on. Now, I'm going to break this into two parts, just because if I try to get all of this into one video, as I said, we have 82 champions here, it's going to be way too long. So we're going to stop halfway, and it just happens that halfway is around here, as you can see. We're gonna stop on Robbie Lawler, and then the next part of this video will start with Khabib Nurmagomedov. So let's jump straight into it. We're starting with Mark Coleman, and I like that we're starting here. I didn't pick the order of these, I just uploaded the photos and this is the way they came in. So it's cool that we're starting with Mark Coleman because he's the first ever UFC champion, the first ever heavyweight champion. He beat Dan Severn to win the belt, and it was a really good performance against a really good guy at the time in Dan Severn. He was a beast, as his name says. But he loses the belt straight away to Maurice Smith. He had no title defenses. So it's obviously marks taken away from Mark Coleman for that. But the historical impact that he made, being the first champion, you got to give him some credit for that. But no championship reigns, and the way he lost that fight, he was absolutely exhausted against Maurice Smith, who proved that striking could work against these high-level wrestlers back in the day. You got to bring him down some points. So I'm not going to quite put him in D, where a lot of these like zero defenses champions will go. I'll go C. He'll be kind of low C, but because he has that historical impact, he's got to go a little bit higher than D for me. Next up, Israel Adesanya. Very, very interesting. So Izzy is the current UFC middleweight champion. Of course, he just fought Jan Blachowicz for the light heavyweight belt. Unfortunately, it didn't go Izzy's way, but we're not going to count that because it wasn't part of his championship reign. Izzy so far has been a really good champion. In terms of his actual performances, each one apart from the Yoel Romero one has been fantastic, and we're going to count Izzy's title win against Kelvin Gastelum as well, because he did unify the belt. But the Kelvin Gastelum fight, amazing performance, real championship guts in that 5th round. Then he comes on and he beats Robert Whittaker for the belt, he unifies it, and then he beats Yoel Romero, as I said, one defense, and then Paulo Costa, another defense, which was excellent. So the Yoel Romero fight isn't great, but 2 title defenses, 3 if you want to count the Robert Whittaker one, but you know, that wasn't a title defense, that was a unification. Izzy probably right now is B for me. He's not quite an A as a champion yet, but a couple more title defenses I think he might sneak into A, especially if his performances match those of the Paulo Costa win or the Robert Whittaker win, Bobby Knuckles. Next up, Jose Aldo. I mean, he's an absolute great, right? I think some people might be tempted to put him in A, but I think he's got to go in S. We're not considering his WEC run, but if the WEC run was included, then he's high S in my opinion. But 7 title defenses in the UFC. Mark Hominick, Kenny Florian, Chad Mendes, Frankie Edgar, Chan Sung Jung, Ricardo Lamas, and Chad Mendes. Some people take some points away for the loss to Conor McGregor, 13 seconds, but I don't take too much away from him for that. Of course, he won an interim belt then, right? Although he was promoted to the undisputed champion as well, so a 2-time champion, 7 title defenses, amazing performances throughout. I think Jose Aldo has to be S tier, right? Next up, Aljamain Sterling. He's got to go D, right? I mean, the way he won the belt, very controversial. DQ finish, I guess for historical impact. He's high up on the list because it's the first time it ever happened. The first time a title has changed hands by DQ. And this isn't a comment on Aljamain Sterling and whether he faked an injury to win the belt or not. But, I mean, it's D. Next up, Eddie Alvarez. So, Eddie Alvarez has had an amazing career, particularly outside the UFC. But if you actually look at his title reign, he won the belt against Rafael Desano in a really good performance, finished him in the 1st round, but then had no title defenses afterwards, and that loss to Conor, I think in some ways even more so than the Aldo loss, it's going to really stick with him because it was such a phenomenal performance by Conor. I think Eddie's championship reign is almost defined by that, which is unfortunate for Eddie because, as I said, he's had an absolutely fantastic career, but no title defenses, a particularly bad loss. I think he's got to go D, right? And again, we're going to order these once we get them in, so we'll order, like Eddie Alvarez will be quite a bit higher than Aljamain Sterling in the end, but still in the same tier. Anderson Silva, well, this is a no-brainer. Anderson Silva is S tier. He'd be close to the top of this S tier, I think, by the end of it, because aside from Demetrius Johnson, Anderson Silva has the most title defenses in UFC history at 10. He beat some really good guys. He beat some not so great guys, or at least not so great compared to what he was at the time. They were kind of easy fights for him. But that just goes to show you how good he was. And to defend the title 10 times and do it in spectacular fashion in many occasions, or on many occasions, like for example when he choked out Dan Henderson, like for example when he dominated Rich Franklin to win the belt and then defend the belt, like when he front kicked Vitor Belfort, or when he triangled Chael Sonnen in the dying minutes of a 5-round fight. Anderson Silva is S tier. I'm going to place him. I'm not going to order them right now, but I just got to place Anderson Silva just above Jose Aldo there, and we'll revisit. Andrei Arlovsky. So Andrei Arlovsky for his time was a really good champion and was one of the guys in my very early years of watching MMA I love to watch, because he was such an exciting champion. And compared to some of the heavyweight champions before him, Tim Sylvia, not the most exciting champion, but successful, and we'll talk about him. But Andrei Arlovsky just brought something else to the game. He was an excellent boxer, excellent striker, had some really funky submissions as well, had some footlocks. He won the title by a footlock against Tim Sylvia, and he was one of the more dominant champions of his time. The only problem is, for Andrei Arlovsky, his title defenses weren't particularly that impressive just because of the opposition. They were impressive in terms of he beat guys really quickly and really violently, but Paul Buentello, Justin Eilers, and they're not the best opposition you can fight. And then he loses the belt to Tim Sylvia. So a few pegs down, I think, for Arlovsky. I think he'll probably be low B for me, Andrei Arlovsky, just because of that opposition wasn't fantastic. Renan Barão had an amazing career. Of course, when he won the belt, he was on an absolutely insane win streak. He, of course, won the belt, an interim belt, first because Dominick Cruz was out. He defended the interim belt twice, which is very rare. Defended it against Michael McDonald and Eddie Wineland. Beat both guys, of course. Then he was promoted to the undisputed champion, and then he beat Uriah Faber. So 3 title defenses, technically, because we're counting the interim belt now that he was a unified champion. But in terms of his actual championship reign, I don't think he can go higher than B, right? Next up, Bas Rutten. I'm a big Bas Rutten stan. I love Bas Rutten, one of my favourite fighters of all time. But let's be honest, let's call a spade a spade. His UFC championship run was really bad, probably one of the worst in company history, unfortunately. So he wins the belt against Kevin Randleman in an extremely controversial decision. I probably scored it to Kevin Randleman. And then he vacates the belt. I think he intended to fight in Pride afterwards, but eventually he just retired because of his back injury, I believe. So, I mean, Bas Rutten has to go low, doesn't he? He has to be a D-tier champion. Vitor Belfort, I think similar to Aljamain Sterling, right? He was very fortuitous to win the belt. So he fought Randy Couture for the light heavyweight title, and his glove grazed Randy in the eye, and the fight was stopped because Randy couldn't see out of his eye, rightfully so. But it was counted as a punch, so Vitor won the fight and won the belt. But then he fought Randy in a rematch, and Randy dominated him. So, I mean, D for Vitor Belfort, unfortunately. Next up, Michael Bisping. Michael Bisping has a really feel-good championship reign. He beats Luke Rockhold. Luke Rockhold at the time was extremely dominant at middleweight, and it was on short notice too, so he's got to get some points for that. And then he defends the belt against Dan Henderson in a rematch from their UFC 100 fight. Wins the fight. Probably got a little bit lucky with the decision, but one title defense, beat a really dominant guy late in his career. I'm going to count that because, no one expected Michael Bisping to win the belt at the time he did. So I got to count that a little bit. He's higher than like Mark Coleman because he has that one title defense, even though it was a little bit fortuitous. But does he sneak into B? I'm not sure if he sneaks into B. He might be C. He's probably a C tier champion at this point, but really feel good title reign in my opinion. Murilo Bustamante, another middleweight champion. the second ever middleweight champion, who beat Dave Manet for the belt and showed a lot of stand-up skills. He was a BJJ guy, but he was one of the first guys that I saw that was really well-rounded. And like, of course, his jiu-jitsu was always a strong suit, but he was really well-rounded. He had one title defense against Matt Linland where you need to go back and watch this. He submitted him twice. So he submits him, Matt Linland taps. Linland says that he didn't tap. John McCarthy was like, okay, I'm not sure, so we'll restart the fight. And then Bustamante finished him again. Incredible stuff. But then unfortunately what happened was it was the last fight in his contract, that Linland fight, and he didn't re-sign with the UFC because the UFC didn't offer him enough money. They essentially, what happened, long story short, he was offered a contract. It was okay, apparently, reportedly. He went off and said, I'm just going to check what Pride and all these other organizations will offer. They didn't offer anything more than the UFC. So he's like, yeah, I'll go back. I'll sign the contract that the UFC offered me. And then the UFC were like, oh, we're going to offer you less money. So, yeah. I mean, I think Bustamante could have been an A tier champion the way he was trending. But I think he probably falls down to C just because of what happened. It's unfortunate for Bustamante, but only one title defense. It's kind of tough to go any further for him. Carlos Newton, a welterweight champion. I believe he was the second welterweight champion. Second welterweight champion. Beat Pat Miletich by a bulldog choke. Incredible finish. You got to watch it. And yeah, he lost the belt after that to Matt Hughes in crazy fashion. Hughes slammed him. Hughes knocked himself out while he slammed him, but the referee didn't notice that he was out as well, so Hughes won the belt. But if you go watch the fight and watch the aftermath, you can hear Hughes tell his corner, yeah, I was out. 100% I was out. So they eventually done the rematch. It wasn't an immediate rematch. Hughes beat Sakurai after that, and Carlos Newton couldn't regain the belt. So, I mean, he's got to be a D-tier champion. His finish against Pat Miletich was excellent. It's a highlight reel, bulldog choke. You just don't see that at least not in men's MMA these days. Hendrix Cejudo, our first two-weight world champion. You have him winning the belt at flyweight first and then at bantamweight. Of course, he beats Demetrius Johnson for the belt in another kind of controversial fight, so he might be able to take some points away from Henry for that one. But I got to give him credit for making the improvements that he did from their first fight to the second. He looked great in the second fight. I thought he lost it, but he looked great. He should get some credit for that. He defended the belt once against the bantamweight champion, TJ Dillashaw, who came down, took some EPO and lost. But then he went up and won the bantamweight belt, and it wasn't against the champion. It was against Marlon Moraes because the championship was vacated. But you got to give him credit for beating the champion down at flyweight anyway. So he did beat the bantamweight champion. And then he went up and he beat another guy to actually take the belt, and then he retired. So I think Henry is probably low B. I think he probably should have had a couple more fights at flyweight before he was eligible to go for that second world title. But it seems like the UFC these days will just allow it for anybody. But still, credit where credit's due. I think he's low in this. He's definitely below the likes of these guys for sure. But we'll see. Maybe he'll bump down to C because he has a lack of actual title defenses. Up next, Chuck Liddell, a extremely revered fighter and a revered champion. He did do a lot of his better work outside of the title reign, but his actual title reign was fantastic too. So he wins the belt against Randy Couture in a rematch. Randy, of course, beat Chuck when Tito looked for an interim belt when Tito wouldn't fight Chuck, who was the rightful number one contender. So then Chuck wins a rematch a few fights down the line, knocks him out. And then if you look at his actual title defenses, then knockout, 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 a couple of TKOs, but you know, same thing. He beats Tito Ortiz, Renato Sobral, Randy Couture again, that was their third fight, and Jeremy Horde, a really good submission guy. So I think Chuck Liddell sneaks into A for sure. I think he sneaks into A. Not S tier, not as a champion, might be an S tier fighter, particularly for his impact historically. He was one of the 4 stars, him along with Tito Ortiz, one of the 4 stars in MMA. So he's got to get credit for that. I think he sneaks into A. So next up, Daniel Cormier, another 2-weight world champion, our second 2-weight world champion, wins the belt at light heavyweight. Of course, the big problem for Daniel at light heavyweight was that he didn't beat the champion. He didn't beat Jon Jones, but he beat a guy who was number 2 for a long time in Anthony Johnson, and then he defends against Alexander Gustafsson, who pushed Jon Jones to the limits. Anthony Johnson again in a rematch, and then Volkan Ozdemir, which is probably the one that doesn't really age as well. But then he goes up and he wins the title at heavyweight, and that was one of the fights where, one of the kind of super fights, dual champion, 2-tier champion fights, I didn't really mind because Cormier had 3 title defenses at light heavyweight. There weren't that many interesting contenders there. And he had a history at heavyweight, and he pretty much didn't really continue that career at heavyweight because of his friend Cain Velasquez and training partner. So I think it was, I was all for that 2-weight world championship fight. He goes up there and he beats the champion and one of the better, or probably the best heavyweight champions of all time in Stipe Miocic. So that's a legitimate win. Defends once against Derek Lewis and then loses to Stipe Miocic again in a rematch. So I think he'd ranks better than Izzy. Similar amount of title defenses, but 2 world champions and legitimate wins. He might sneak into A. I think he might sneak into low A, Daniel Cormier, for me. I'm going to go low A for Daniel Cormier. Next up, we have Dominick Cruz, another bantamweight champion, the first UFC bantamweight champion. Came over from the WEC, was awarded the bantamweight championship because he was the bantamweight champion in the WEC. And then he defends the belt against Uriah Faber and Demetrius Johnson in a win that does age very well, even though it was DJ at 135 pounds, clearly not his best weight class. But then he never loses the belt. He has to give it up when Renan Barão won the interim belt because he just couldn't get healthy. Eventually he did return and he won the belt again, beats TJ Dillashaw. And TJ Dillashaw at the time was a next level, future generation, not version of Dominick Cruz, but it seemed like he perfected what Dominick Cruz started in some ways. And Dom comes in and beats him, which is just super impressive. And then he defended the belt against Uriah Faber. So not the greatest win at that time because Uriah was clearly past his best, but 2-time champion, 3 title defenses. I think 3 good title defenses, particularly his first reign, and then beating TJ Dillashaw, that's big. I think Dominick, for me, doesn't have a lot of title defenses, but does he get some credit for coming back after injury and slightly getting to A tier? I think he's in the middle. If it was a B+, he'd be B+ for me. Does he go there? He might have to go B. He might have to go B for now. But he's touching A. He's touching A because I think what he done was really impressive. Our first female champion, it is Cris Cyborg. Not the first 145-pound champion in the UFC, but the second. Jermaine the Randomy was the first champion. In terms of opposition, we're going to go C. High C, because what she done was good. But she beat Holly Holm, who isn't a 145-pounder. She beat Yana Kunitskaya. Again, probably isn't a 145-pounder. They were impressive wins, but yeah, she beat Tonya Evinger for the belt as well, which again, not the best win in the world. So even though she has 2 title defenses, just the opposition just wasn't there for me. So she can't quite sneak into B tier. TJ Dillashaw, we spoke about him a minute ago when we were talking about Dominick Cruz. Just excellent fighter. Let's not talk about his EPO use just yet. Let's talk about him as a fighter and what he did. He goes in there and pulls off one of the biggest upsets in UFC history, really, against Renan Barão, who was just a beast back then. Beats him. He wins a rematch. Then eventually he fights Joe Soto first and then wins a rematch against Renan Barão. And then he loses the belt to Dominick Cruz, but then regains it against Cody Garbrandt and then beats Cody Garbrandt in a rematch. And that was coming off Cody Garbrandt's amazing fight against Dominick Cruz. So TJ gets a lot of credit for that. I think he might sneak into B. I think he might sneak into B tier for me relative to everybody else. I think he might. But then he lost the belt because of EPO. But go B for now. He might sneak down. We'll see. I don't know. Rafael Desano is a lightweight champion, a very unlikely lightweight champion because nobody expected Rafael Desano to beat Anthony Pettis, but he did. He goes in there and stops Anthony Pettis, and then he defends the belt against Cowboy Cerrone, which was a good win at the time, but in hindsight, when you look at it, you're like, Cowboy Cerrone probably wasn't an elite fighter, probably wasn't a championship fighter really. So 1 title defense, and then of course he loses it to Eddie Alvarez in the first round. So I think he's probably a C tier champion for me. Next up, Junior Dos Santos, another heavyweight champion here. Seems like one of the nicest guys in MMA, so it does hurt me a little bit that I'm gonna have to put him a little bit low on this list. So he beats Cain Velasquez on Fox, knocks him out really quickly, and then he has 1 title defense against Frank Mir, finishes him in the second round and looked really good, gets that Nike sponsorship somewhere around there, I think, and then he loses devastatingly to Cain Velasquez. He doesn't go D, Junior Dos Santos, because he had that title defense, but I think he's kind of mid to low C, unfortunately. 1 title defense, cool, but just got absolutely blasted by Cain Velasquez. Frankie Edgar, really impressive title reign from Frankie Edgar, particularly because he probably wasn't a lightweight. He probably isn't even a featherweight. He's probably a bantamweight realistically, but beats BJ Penn, who seemed unstoppable at the time, and then he beats him in a rematch. And of course those two fights were close, especially the first one. Well, the second one wasn't close. Frankie won that one all day. First one was close. I scored it to Frankie. I don't know if I'm in the minority for that. Let me know in the comments. But I scored it to Frankie, and regardless, it was an excellent win. And then the second one was even better. Then he defends against Gray Maynard. It goes to a draw, so he keeps the belt, but just an absolute world-class fight, all-time great fight. And then another all-time great fight against Gray Maynard when they rematched at UFC 136. He gets a lot of credit in the entertainment value. He gets a lot of credit for beating BJ Penn. 2 title defenses technically, because the draw isn't a successful title defense. So I think he ranks somewhere in B here. Carla Esparza, the first ever UFC strawweight champion, coming off The Ultimate Fighter, beats Rose Namajunas, which aged well, although Rose at the time wasn't as good as she is now, of course. But it seemed like Carla Esparza might have been a really dominant champion, because her particular style seemed like it matched up really well with the better girls in that division. And then Joanna Jędrzejczyk came along, and we didn't realise just how good she was and how good her sprawl and brawl game was, and she absolutely dominated her. So a 92-day reign for Carla Esparza gets dominated by Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I mean, she's got to go down here, doesn't she? She's got to go on to D, unfortunately. Next up, Evan Tanner. So another middleweight champion, the third middleweight champion in UFC history. The issue with Evan was that he never defended the belt, which is 1, and 2, he didn't beat the champion to win the belt, because Bustamante left the organization. So he beat David Tyrell, right? Yeah, David Tyrell in a good performance. I mean, good, well done. And you know, I was a fan of Evan Tanner back in the day. He was one of the first guys that I really liked. He just seemed like a nice dude, and rest in peace, because if you don't know his story, he had a really tragic death. But you can't go any further than D, right? Davison Figuerado, the current UFC flyweight champion, has been really entertaining so far. Looks like a bit of a force at flyweight. He beat Joseph Benavidez for the title, the bridesmaid, never the bride, Joseph Benavidez, because Henry Cejudo retired and vacated his belt, and he looked really impressive in that. And then, and of course, he beat him first, and he didn't make weight, so then he had to fight again, and then he beat him again. But then he defended against Alex Perez, looked really good in that fight. And then he had a draw with Brandon Moreno. So it's still really early into his title reign. I think if he's going to go low C for me right now. I think if he won the Brandon Moreno fight, he would be high C. Maybe, yeah, but high C, I don't think he'd crack B. Next up, Forrest Griffin, another extremely unlikely champion, this time at light heavyweight. Of course, he beat Shogun when Shogun made it to the UFC. That's how he got his title fight. And then he goes in there and he beats Quentin Rampage Jackson. Again, completely unexpected. But then he has no title defenses and loses in not devastating fashion, but gets absolutely dominated and finished by Rashad Evans. So no title defenses, but beats Rampage Jackson. Really, it's a consequential win, right? But I think it's similar in a way to like Carlos Newton, where Carlos Newton, he beat a important champion in Pat Miletich, but then he couldn't defend his belt, and then never really got back to that point. So I think Forrest Griffin has to be the champion. Next up, Cody Garbrandt. Cody Garbrandt was a really strange champion because he put in a performance unlike anything else he ever created or ever done against Dominick Cruz. Like, he outslicked Dominick Cruz. He looked like an absolute world beater in that fight. And then he goes in there and he just loses to TJ Dillashaw twice and looks particularly bad in doing so. He makes the exact same mistakes. He gets into this war with TJ, who's just a more technical, defensively astute striker, and gets finished. I mean, I think he might be top of D because he hadn't like incredible all-time great performance against Dominick Cruz, but then loses twice to TJ Dillashaw. I know that the second one wasn't a title reign, but I say twice because it kind of confirms the first loss, especially because it looked almost identical. So I'm not counting that other loss, but I'm just saying it was confirmed. So he loses in devastating fashion. He's got to go D. I think high D because it was such an incredible fight against Dominick Cruz, against one of the better bantamweight champions of all time. Germaine de Randamie is going to go D. She's going to go similar to Aljamain Sterling, maybe even worse in some ways. No, she's going to go similar to Aljamain Sterling. So she wins the belt at 145 pounds, the first 145 pound champion, but then refuses to defend the belt against Chris Cyborg and just vacates it Also, the win against Holly Holm wasn't particularly impressive. It was also very controversial because she fouled like 3 or 4 times in the fight and no points were taken. And if there were a couple of points taken, or I think even 1 point, Holly Holm would have won, or it would have been a draw, right? And realistically 2 or 3 could have been taken, so she's got to go low. Benson Henderson is up next, a lightweight champion. Not a forgotten lightweight champion, because he was the lightweight champion for a long time, 552 days. And he had 3 title defenses and a couple of memorable ones, but not memorable for the best reason. So he beat Frankie Edgar in a very close fight. He defends against Frankie Edgar in a very close fight. But then he dominates Nate Diaz on Fox. And then he beats Gilbert Melendez in another really, really close fight. I mean, he ranks... Yeah, I think he's low B. He's got to get some credit for those title defenses, even if you disagree with them. But he's going to be low B, edging on C because of the controversy. Especially the 2-pick, man. He fought with a 2-pick in his mouth. Crazy. Next up, we have Johnny Hendrix. A disappointing champion, right? At welterweight, Johnny Hendrix. So my issue with Johnny Hendrix is I think he probably won that first GSP fight. Didn't get the decision. Then fights Robbie Lawler. Wins that one, looks really impressive. Like, he has a great fight then in a rematch against Robbie Lawler. Loses the belt and then falls off a cliff and just never seen in the championship, I guess, arena ever again. So yeah, it's got to be D for me. He's got to be D, bro. Next up, Max Holloway, featherweight. One of the best featherweight champions of all time. Not quite as a champion Jose Aldo levels. Like, I mean, if you just look at the amount of defenses. But he did beat Jose Aldo and beat him really badly, or well, if you're on Max Holloway's side. Beats Brian Ortega, record-breaking fight. Pieces him up, looks unbelievable. Brian Ortega was looking fantastic at that time too. And then again, beats up Frankie Edgar, mauls him. Then loses the belt to Alexander Volkanovski. So I think in terms of a champion, if he won that Volkanovski fight, I think he might be A. But, or is he? Is he A? 3 title defenses against 2 extremely good challengers, and Frankie Edgar, who might be receding in his talents a little bit and his qualities. But yeah, I'm going to go low A for a minute. For what he did, those performances, we're going to go low A for a minute. Holly Holm up next. I mean, what can you say about Holly Holm? She beats Ronda Rousey, the most dominant champion in that division until Amanda Nunes. And it was a highlight that's going to be played forever, in perpetuity. I think she gets bumped up to C because of that. Even though she lost the belt in her next fight against Miesha Tate, she did look good in that fight and she probably was en route to winning it. And then Miesha Tate just pulled out a Hail Mary submission win. But I think just on the weight of that Ronda Rousey win, I think Holly Holm has to be C, low C now, but C. Jan Blachowicz. So Jan Blachowicz, again, another completely unlikely champion at 205 pounds. Again, you have the problem that he didn't beat Jon Jones, kind of like with Daniel Cormier, but he's fought and beat everyone who's been thrown at him so far, including Israel Adesanya. And you can talk about is he being light for weight class, but it was still a phenomenal challenge. And I don't think weight was a big factor, but I also thought that Jan Blachowicz should be given some credit for the skills that he showed. So he beats Dominic Reyes, who could have been the champion, let's be honest. I think he probably beat Jon Jones when they fought, and then beats Israel Adesanya. I think he's high C for now. Next up we have Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I think S tier for me straight away. So 5 title defenses, the greatest champion so far in women's strawweight history, and she just had some really great performances. She's kind of the face of that division still, in my opinion. I know you have Weili Zhang there, who could be a phenomenal champion. She looks great. Rose Namajunas in the future could regain the belt, and she was a good champion. But I just think what Joanna did in that division was special. For what she did in that title reign, it was a special title reign. I think she ranks high. Next up, Jens Pulver, the first ever UFC lightweight champion. And his title reign was really, really good. I mean, he beats Kel Luno for the belt. Kel Luno was a shootout champion at the time. So that meant a lot because shootout's lightweight division and kind of the lighter weight classes, they were seen to have the best lighter fighters. So beating Kel Luno was a big deal. And he looked good in doing it. He showed why he was so good, why his sprawl and brawl game was so effective against these guys. And then he beats Dennis Hallman, a similar enough performance, probably not as entertaining as the Kel Luno fight, but still a very good sprawl and brawl performance. Didn't let Dennis Hallman really get off. Then he beat BJ Penn, and it was BJ Penn, I think, at 4-0 as far as I remember, but still really excellent performance against a guy who was a legitimate prodigy, and again showed why he was that good. Unfortunately, he had a contract dispute with the UFC and left afterwards, so he didn't get to defend his belt more. But I think Jens Pulver could have easily been an A or S champion if he continued, but unfortunately with 2 title defenses, the historical precedent is there, but I don't quite think that he gets up to A. I think he's on the cusp of A. 1 more title defense he might have, or 1 or 2 more title defenses, and he might have. Up next, we have Jessica Andrade, a 1-term champion, didn't defend the belt, beat Rose Namajunas in a strange finish. I mean, she picked her up and threw her on her head and won the belt, but then couldn't defend it and lost pretty handily to Weili Zhang. So I think she's got to go to D. Next up, Mighty Mouse. No brainer, right? He's going to go somewhere at the top there of S. He might go ahead of Anderson Silva, we'll see. But Mighty Mouse, like, what can you say? He has the most consecutive UFC title defenses of all time at 11. Beats Anderson Silva in title defenses, not in a fight. That'd be weird. Beats John Dodson twice, and that was probably his toughest fight. He came through that tournament that the UFC done, which was very impressive, to win the belt. Beats likes of Ian McCall and stuff like that. And then has some really good wins over the likes of Horiguchi, Henry Cejudo the first time. Ray Borg, decent win, but the actual finish was amazing. Wilson Hayes, again, another amazing finish. So, yeah, Demetrius Johnson is S tier, no doubt. Loses the belt as well in a controversial fashion. I thought he probably won that fight. Next up, Jon Jones. We'll just throw him straight up there into S tier. Not ordered correctly, but straight into S tier, of course. So, Jon Jones could have had the same amount of consecutive defenses as Demetrius Johnson or more, but he unfortunately just kept getting in the way of himself. So we have Jon Jones at 8 consecutive title defenses technically, but not really, because there's some breaks in between there where he was stripped of belts and stuff like that. But he has 8 successful title defenses, and look at the names: Quinton Jackson, Lyoto Machida, Rashad Evans, Vitor Belfort, Chael Sonnen, whatever, Alexander Gustafsson, Glover Teixeira, and Daniel Cormier. I'm not saying whatever, because, you know, Chael Sonnen's the GOAT, we know that, but a little bit past that at that time, and not particularly a great 100 or a 205er. But I mean, talk about your picograms or whatever, but Jon Jones is an S tier champion. Josh Barnett, D tier. I'm a bit of a Josh Barnett stan as well. I'm a big fan, but he always had drug problems, right? Performance enhancing drug problems, and unfortunately when he won the belt, he tested positive for some kind of banned substance after beating Randy Couture and was stripped of the belt, and he left the organization. Funny story, he actually tested positive for the fight before that against Bobby Hoffman too, but the commission didn't even give him a ban. They kind of just said, don't do it again. They didn't even give him a fine. They said, Josh, don't do that again, don't take drugs again. And then he takes some kind of performance enhancer against Randy Couture, and yeah, it is what it is, I guess. But yeah, he's D tier, unfortunately, for Josh. Next up, Kevin Randleman, and I think Kevin Randleman's a fairly good C tier champion somewhere in there, right? So he wins the belt against Pete Williams, who was a good prospect at the time, looked like a good fighter. Of course, Bas Rutten had vacated the belt, so that's why he didn't fight Bas. Although Bas and him fought for that belt when Bas won it, and I thought Kevin probably won that fight. But either way, he had 1 title defense against Pedro Hizo, who really good fighter, phenomenal leg kicks. Good title defense, but then loses the belt to Randy Couture, who decided to return to the UFC. So you can't go any further than C, but you know, I think he was a bit of an underrated champion, the beast. Next up, Robbie Lawler, another unlikely champion in some ways, because when he left the UFC and fought in different organizations, he had some success, but eventually he found himself in Strikeforce, kind of floundered there. And when the UFC brought Strikeforce guys back over, I don't think there was that much of an expectation that he would compete for a belt, but he drops back down to welterweight and goes on an absolute tear. I mean, he fights Johnny Hendrix, probably beats him. Johnny Hendrix gets the nod, he wins the belt, but then in the rematch he beats him. Another fantastic fight, and then he has 2 all-time great fights against Rory McDonald and Carlos Condit, and I think with those 2 title defenses he might bump low B for me. I think the entertainment factor of those, I mean, if you're talking about 2 of the greatest fights in UFC history, you're at least putting Rory McDonald up there. That might even be number 1 or 2, and I think Carlos Condit fight probably makes the top 5 or top 10. So I think for entertainment value there, and he beat the top guys at the time. So I'm going to say Robbie Lawler gets him to B. So that's it for part 1. As you can see, it was kind of long. That's why I wanted to make this into a two-parter. So I'll be back very shortly with part 2, but let me know if you disagree or agree with any of my picks. Did I get somebody completely wrong? And as I said, some of these might move slightly, not drastically, but slightly. There might be one or two that'll move through the tiers, but we'll also organize them at the end. But that's it for part 1. Look out for part 2, and like and subscribe, comment below, all that jazz, and I'll see you very